Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. While the wealthiest nations in the world are responsible for the bulk of emissions we see, it's the poor nations that are most vulnerable. The disparity is evident, and this inequality is one of the many reasons that demand global cooperation on climate action. But in terms of this global cooperation, where do we stand today? That's our discussion, and joining us for it is Mr. Sven, Global Policy Lead, Climate Change and Resilience at CARE International. He joins us from Bonn. Also joining us today is Mr. Ometto, who is a senior researcher at the Brazilian Institute of Space Research and the head of the Earth System Science Center. He joins us from Brazil. Thank you both for joining us, and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Mr. Harmeling, let's jump right into it. Now, we see this global disparity in terms of those countries that produce the greatest amount of emissions and those that are most vulnerable to climate change. What really determines this disparity? What really makes the vulnerable countries more vulnerable?
I think one element of that disparity is actually that those countries who are particularly vulnerable have contributed least to the problem, and that's of course a grave injustice. They are particularly vulnerable, whether you look at, for example, small island states. They often have a very low above waters, and sea level rise and increasing storm surges have a very negative effect on those countries. Already today, there are already a number of examples where, for example, fertile agricultural land in the coastal area is salinized and so basically loses its quality. Then there are, of course, many countries, for example, in Africa, which generally suffer from a state of poverty in many parts in the society, weak institutions, and then they are overwhelmed often by more extreme climatic conditions, be it increased or more intense heat waves, sometimes even coupled with torrential rain events, storm events, and all of this makes those countries particularly vulnerable. They have less capacity to respond, to adapt. It's not that they are not doing nothing. There's a lot of things going on. But coming back to my earlier point, they have hardly contributed anything to the problem, while the richer parts of this world, both in terms of countries and richer populations, are most responsible for the fossil fuel emissions in particular.
Right. You mentioned here injustice while you were describing everything that's happening. And I'm going to take this to Mr. Ometto and ask him, Mr. Ometto, how does the idea of justice fit into this entire conversation of climate change resilience and climate change cooperation? Where do we find justice in trying to balance out this disparity?
Responsibility that is not common at this point, but because of the change of the atmosphere. So although this is out there, how we deal with this? So the injustice that you mentioned, it goes along not only with access to a non-clean atmosphere, non-clean environment, it goes along with the disparity and inequality in the globe. So we need for sure to act that. Climate change in some aspects exacerbate these conditions. And how we can think on this, it's considering the injustice, is how the cooperation and how mechanism for cooperation and to technology transfers, science and co-development transfers, options being co-developing between the countries that has most contributed to changing in the atmosphere environment, to change in the way that the global climate is operating nowadays, and to the most vulnerable countries. So there's questions on, especially on adaptation and considering agriculture, considering health, considering fresh water access, quality, considering local livelihoods. So how this transfer of this knowledge to deal with this fact that is out there, that's one way to move forward and to reduce the injustice related to climate and environmental changes.
Right, Mr. Harmeling, as Ometto stated that this transfer of technology is one way that we can address this injustice. You stated earlier that there's a lot of things that are happening in these countries that we don't assume, but that are actually, in fact, the most vulnerable. How much of what's happening on ground can be attributed to those countries trying to rectify their own behavior by, supporting these countries, the more developed countries lending support to these developing nations?
Well, I would start that in many of the vulnerable developing countries, there's now much stronger ownership and awareness of the problem of climate impact and how much it affects them, that they've taken initiatives to, for example, develop national adaptation plans, or civil society organizations developing adaptation projects, whether in agriculture, water, etc. But I think it's also important to highlight that there is not only a moral but also a legal obligation by developed countries in particular to support vulnerable developing countries with climate finance. It has been reasserted, so to say, by the Paris Agreement, which most developed countries also ratify. I think a challenge is that the support provided lags far behind the needs in terms of financial amounts, but also it often doesn't sufficiently channel the money to the particularly poor and vulnerable groups. And in our view as CARE, it's also particular about supporting women-led groups, because in many countries we see particularly adverse situations for women and girls, and we need to have targeted support there. I think that's an important dimension, and in particular in the current situation with the COVID-19 impacts, we need to uphold the obligation by developed countries that they stick to their commitments. The final point I want to add here is basically that we also need to have a stronger equity lens on the climate policies in terms of emission reductions as well as adaptation that are being implemented also in the richer countries. And that's something which a recent report by Oxfam has also alluded to, that there's a lack of equity lens, so to say, if there are subsidies for, let's say, luxury goods or for private jets and these kind of things. It's something to look into whether these parts of society don't have to make more contributions to climate finance and to tackling the problems that they've done in the past. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be done and can be done for a more equitable approach.
Right. Mr. Malik, you give me a very good opening to put this next question, which is 5 years after the Paris Agreement, where do you see us standing on global cooperation today?
I think in a way the cooperation has continued. There has been quite a number of initiatives even after the Paris Agreement was agreed to facilitate cooperation in adaptation, in emission reduction, etc. But I think that the biggest challenge is that so far this doesn't really result in the necessary emission reductions we need to see, and also there's a lack of progress on adaptation. This year all countries are expected to and obliged to present new climate action plans to the UN context, and we really need to see that these plans add up in a way that they significantly reduce the gap we're seeing between the 1.5 degrees limit of the Paris Agreement and the very, very dangerous trajectory we're globally still on. Last night you may have heard an announcement from China and a couple of days ago from the EU that they intend to increase their ambition. That's, I think, is an important signal, even though we think more needs to be done, but at least it puts the issue back on the table on the highest political level, and we're seeing the negative impacts unfold on a daily basis everywhere, more or less, and we really don't have any time to lose and really need to step up the game here.
Right. I'm going to come back to what you mentioned about these new reevaluated plans that need to be presented, giving this 5-year mark. But I want to take the same question to Mr. Ometto. Mr. Ometto, 5 years onwards from the Paris Agreement, where do you think we're standing? How much progress have we made?
Well, I think Sven brought some very important point in there. And one aspect is that there are obligations, and the country has assumed that in general, and but the actions are not really being effective at this point. So we see a very dangerous trajectory above the limits that the science has defined as a danger limit for humanity. So I think that there's progress, and I think some countries are more committed to the progress and to the agreement that they made, and others not. There is a big issue on denial of climate change for important nations at this point, and I think those plays a little bit back in terms of on the global arena on the negotiations. So I think the cooperation that has to arise from local solutions, so country-based solutions. So we're dealing with a global problem, which is the global climate change, but the solutions are at local level, and local levels are under the country's mandate to define their actions they have on their countries. But we're talking about a interconnected society, interconnected humanity. So I think the big issue on this is that there was some very effective or they should be effective proposed on the Paris Agreement, like the big international funds that can help on the transfer of technology and transfer of knowledge for adaptation and mitigation. That has to be.
Mr. Ometto, sorry to interject here. Just to your point of saying that there are a lot of powerful actors that are not playing their part in this, and as you bring up funding, the goal for $100 billion each year, and then when we look at powerful nations, one of the wealthiest nations in the world, the United States, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, how does that impact funding overall?
Well, it does definitely impact, and that's a problem that the country has to deal with, and how we compensate that in such a way that that this issue is minimized. I would say it is a big problem, and that's part of the trajectory and the danger trajectory we're going on. So I think there's a lot of evidence that out there, and you mentioned the United States. So if you take a part of the United States, like California, the governor of California say, okay, so we're facing climate change here on the daily basis, dealing with the big fires out there. So I think there's internal pressure as well, but it is a movement that we need to face it in a way that this big global problem needs to be tackled.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, the issue of the lack of accountability, the lack of enforcement, moving forward from this point onwards, in your circle, in the circle of experts you communicate to and talk to about these issues on a daily basis, are there any innovative solutions in how we can enhance that accountability, that aspect of accountability where developed nations are held to account for their actions and the lack of their contribution in trying to move towards a more climate resilient world?
Yeah, I think you're touching on the right point. I think one of the weaknesses we've seen in the Paris Agreement is that it doesn't include sufficient and basically strong enough compliance mechanisms. Countries didn't want to agree that. They had to find consensus. Not governments necessarily don't like being held accountable. But I think today we have means, and some of these are strengthened. It's about peer pressure, so also to have a differentiated approach, like not always, for example, criticize all developed countries as a whole, but really look into what are the laggards, maybe even the outlaws, and which are the ones who have really understood the change and the actions required and are allies to the vulnerable countries. There have been numerous scientific reports which regularly basically assess the gap in climate action, so to say, as well as the performance of different countries. And I think one thing which is in particular opportunity today, I think even more than 3 or 4 years ago, is that climate change and the need to act is filtering much more into all parts of society, because everyone feels it. I mean, if I talk to my neighbors, they are concerned about the changes in the weather patterns, and these are important starting points to increase the pressure on governments to deliver, and also work with the different parts within governments, knowing that in many countries you have progressive actors and less progressive actors, and I think it's also about strengthening those who are ready to move forward, so to say, for the sake and the benefits of the people of their countries.
Right, I take your point. That's such an important thing to say. Mr. Ometto, one last question to you. You're talking to us from Brazil. Your head of state is an individual who has denied climate change, or in fact tried to, undervalue its impacts. On this point of peer pressure, and I know Mr. Harmeling was talking about how the states need to be held accountable, but within societies, how has movement within Brazil impacted the policies of the government, if at all?
Well, it is a challenging time in that concern, but I take the point that, within the government and within society, we have progressive sectors that are concerned about that. So despite the fact that there's denial out there for more conservative sectors within the government, we see, for instance, the agriculture sector, which agriculture is an important commodity in general that Brazil produces, and it's important for its internal economy, it's important for the society in general. So they're really concerned. So the sector is concerned about the change in the climate patterns, and also not only that, but on the image that the country has in terms of its actions concerning climate change. So I think it's so if we look to the internal plan for adaptation, for instance, this is moving on. So there is the speech to one side, and there's actions to the other side. So I think there is an important concern in terms of the environmental impact, and this is being raising more and more the awareness of more conservative sectors within the government. So, but it's still a challenging times.
Yes, they're challenging times, but I like how you gave us that ray of hope that the private sector can play its role. Thank you so much, Mr. John Ometto, for joining us from Brazil. Mr. Sven Harmeling, how effective is it for private sectors to put that pressure on their governments? I mean, from what we're seeing all across the world, is there an emerging pattern does that bring about change?
I think there definitely is, and we have more and more private companies from very different sectors, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's agricultural commodities, who experience exactly the impact that the colleague just described. And more of these companies speak out in favor of ambitious climate action. And my experience is that this is extremely important because often the, let's say, most powerful parts within governments, whether it's the finance ministries or the economic ministries, basically only listen to such issues or on such issues if it comes from the private sector, and in that regard, it's important to amplify those voices. Of course, still also, let's say, ensure sufficient scrutiny of where the demands or suggestions by private sector basically are consistent and match to the practice they're doing. But I think we need all voices that we can get, and I've seen this having a real impact on policymakers starting to change their minds when they really understand also the challenges that climate change brings about for the private sector and the absolutely need to promote the right set of solutions, renewable energies, climate resilience, getting away from fossil fuels and so on.
Right. Mr. I want to go back to the Paris Agreement and talk to you about it in terms of 2020, the year of the pandemic. How will this shift goals and aims and plans of countries? I mean, what are the things that you fear will happen?
Yeah, I mean, legally, one has to say that, for example, this 2020 deadline for submitting new climate action plans is not touched by this situation. It's enshrined in the decisions in the UN. But of course, we're seeing that many governments and also civil society often struggled to get together and to really have a consultative, basically, approach to upward the ambition, increase emission reduction targets, etc., because just of the lack of possibilities to convene meetings in the COVID situation and so on. But we also hear from many countries, in particular vulnerable countries, that they regard this timeline very important and are intending to move forward. And there have already been some good examples from countries like Rwanda, Vietnam, which have basically submitted sharper climate action plans. I think what is really important to message over and over again is no government, no country, no business actor has to wait for the next UN climate conference to happen to take action. We know enough. We know what needs to be done. There have been many commitments made, and it's really about changing course now. And then we can come to the next UN FCCC climate conference in Glasgow end of next year and hopefully really see that things have changed step by step, and now that we need to accelerate that. But I think that's one of my key messages. We know enough to take action now. There's no legitimate reason to wait for the next international conference to take place first.
Right, and I think that is an extremely important point that you make there, that there is no need to wait for a deadline to take action, because we all know how pressing this issue is. Mr. Sven Harmeling, I want to compare my own assessment to what we saw in the Refugee Compact, in which there was a complete lack of cooperation. When we talk about the climate crisis and global cooperation on it, do you think it still fares better than other global issues, whether it's the refugee crisis or the pandemic? Do you still think that the climate crisis is better handled?
I think we can say that we're building on a system and a climate policy regime which, despite all its weaknesses, has evolved over many years. And there are still many initiatives out there where countries actually get together and cooperate. And sometimes on a more technical level, sometimes focused on climate resilience, sometimes on renewable energies. And all of these pieces, I think, over time add up to more action. But as I said earlier, we need to accelerate this and also probably confront more actively those forces which still undermine climate action, particularly from the fossil fuel sector. But I think more and more governments understand cooperation is the best and most efficient way forward, in solidarity, in supporting the most vulnerable, of course, in particular. But there's even things that one can learn from each other. Bangladesh is often characterized as a country with is a kind of pioneer in adaptation because of many years of experience, and other countries are looking into that, including from the developed world. Cities are exchanging experience across the continent, and I think that is also, let's say, a glimmer of hope to see what happens in many areas. And we need to accelerate this and seek that, in particular, national governments prioritize supporting those progressive forces rather than pulling backwards.
Right. On that point, I want to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Jake Attwood Harris, who advises on all aspects of sustainable design at Hawkins Brown Architects, finding creative solutions by developing project-specific tools and strategies. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Mr. Harris, for joining us, and a very warm welcome to the show. Now, what role does innovation play in terms of moving forward and building more resilience, in making communities more adaptable? And I'm talking specifically in the context of 2020 and moving forward, with this pandemic looming large in the background.
Yes, so typically what we want to be kind of concerned about is an increase in storm-type events in most countries. And, particularly for yourselves, you'd be looking at increased temperatures, increased rainfall in certain periods, and increased droughts in other periods. But like you say, with the pandemic and everything that's going on in 2020, it throws into relief a lot of other issues around health and the particular relationships between the health of the population at large and climate change. And I think that's something that people often tend to ignore, but clearly floods, storms, and all these types of events, which will increase with climate change, have large health impacts. And aside from that as well, aside from the types of problems we're seeing with diseases that are now, there's also the increased risk of things like disease vectors. So when you get different climates happening in different countries, that you get, things like mosquitoes, which can now travel to other areas where they previously couldn't, and that brings with it new diseases and things that different ecosystems haven't seen before. So in terms of the role for creativity and innovation in that sector, some of these things are things that we've known about for a long time. So certain things like we need to reforest hillsides, we need better kind of land management and to control things like urban temperatures, so planting more parks. And these things are quite basic, kind of old-fashioned techniques. So we're just getting more greenery into cities, getting trees on the hillsides, better management of rivers. So clearly there's a whole range of kind of resilience challenges. In terms of the ability of innovation and to meet those challenges and what we can do, as I was saying before, that there's a lot of the more traditional techniques that have always been great. So encouraging nature and making space for wild spaces, which is really important. There's a big difference between a kind of managed landscape or these kind of more simple urban landscapes that we might build. We need space for wilderness so that we can help store carbon in forests and help absorb floodwaters and all those kinds of issues. But in terms of our cities at large and innovation, we need to make sure that they're able to cope with these future demands. So that could mean much hotter summer temperatures. That could mean much higher winds in terms of storm events. And then that goes right into how we design buildings and cities themselves. We need to, for example, the cladding panels, the windows on our skyscrapers, they need to be able to cope with more extreme storms.
Right.
Or our streets and the way that we build might need to cope with hotter future temperatures.
Jake, if I could just intervene here and ask you a question. You talked about how there are a lot of local and traditional ways of creating resilience that we should go back to. In your experience, how much with this influx of technology and this influx of, a globalized way of approaching resilience, do those traditional means get left behind?
I think there is a desire with some people to think we want one solution that will work in any country, in any city. And that's not always the case. So when I say about heating, it might not be that the traditional way of building in the exact city is going to last because it's getting hotter. But what we might do is look to a city that's closer to the equator in a hotter region of the same, but with a similar kind of climate region, and look to the way that they design cities. So there's things such as having buildings tighter together and more shaded streets, or use of things like mashrabiyah to help cool and shade walkways. And we can take, sometimes, we have to take inspiration from looking at other areas of the world. So maybe we look to the Middle East or to the traditional types of buildings in Central America and look at how they dealt with these more hotter, drier climates.
Right. And now my question is probably going to seem like the complete opposite of what I just asked, but through your unique lens of what you do, how can we encourage greater global cooperation in, trying to create resilience and adaptability? Because that's been one of the central themes of our conversation today. Where do we stand on that global cooperation?
Yeah, I think it's an issue, isn't it? Obviously, the first thing to say is without reducing the emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere, this will just get worse and worse. So the first thing is obviously that we need cooperation to just reduce emissions. But obviously then there are other issues. There are resilience issues, and we need cooperation around large storm events, large flooding events, large heat wave events, so that we can help, each country can help support each other. And there are particular issues, actually particular to the region that you're in, around water rights. So there are many rivers which travel through multiple large, heavily populated countries, and currently there's disagreements over the rights to that water, or a lot of countries will claim right to a lot of the flow, but in drought events, those things get particularly more important. So I think the UN slightly stalled on this, and there needs to be greater dialogue, really, particularly between China and the surrounding countries about a lot of the rivers which originate in China and which flow through then to the Indian Ocean.
Right.
There maybe need to be greater kind of coordination of disaster relief efforts as well.
Of course. I'm going to last question to you, Jake, and this is in relation to climate migrants. We're going to see so many people across the world being displaced due to natural disasters, due to climate change. Given that, what ways of creating designs cities need to be aware of, governments need to be aware of in order to keep up with that? We're going to be seeing movement, we're going to be seeing displacement. Moving forward, what do we need to keep in mind in terms of design?
Yeah, I mean, from a kind of more design philosophy point of view, I think it's a fascinating issue. And you're already seeing actually certain governments buying up huge pieces of land in other countries to allow for this. Generally, island nations have been looking at schemes like that so far. But, if we look to the Middle East, we see it's partly and largely to do with conflicts, but those conflicts and a lot of unrest that's been caused recently has been caused partly by climate shifts as well. And you're seeing countries like cities like Beirut doubling population with what happened after the war in Syria. But they have managed to absorb that. It's been slightly tricky, but they've absorbed it over time. And the same thing happening in Amman, in Jordan. So I think there's things that individual cities can do in terms of maybe slightly more liberal or adaptive kind of planning regulations, allowing sites to kind of grow rapidly and shrink rapidly if they have to. And there's things we can do with kind of meanwhile use, we call it in the UK, which is in a way something like a kind of more like a legal version of the kind of temporary cities and that tend to happen when these things aren't regulated, that people, sometimes you get large migrant flows and we set up these kind of uncoordinated communities, but we can build on sites, we can quite easily build, say, 6, 8, 10-story buildings, which are designed to last for, a period of 2 years or 5 years, that can help deal with these larger influxes and then can be moved on and can be redeveloped later, either into more permanent housing or, into a shopping mall or whatever else might be required on that site. But I think, adapting the planning system to allow for this kind of change is really important. And as we see in large events, people tend to want to go back to the region that they're from. These things tend to be more temporary. So I think there's a lot that we can do in that space.
Right. There's so more that I'd like to pick apart with you in terms of this, how we can make those spaces for refugees, for climate migrants more functional, because that is one of the key issues that we're seeing many governments, many countries facing. How do we not let those areas turn into slums, but rather places where, we can continue with our sustainable goals. But unfortunately, we've run out of time there. Thank you so much, Jake Attwood Harris, for joining us from London, Mr. Sven Harmeling for joining us from Bonn. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to have another story for you. Stay tuned. Welcome back. According to new Oxfam research, 32 of the world's largest companies stand to see their profits jump by $109 billion more in 2020 during the pandemic. When poverty rises and inequality deepens, how have firms made profits and at what cost? That's our discussion. Joining us for it is Mr. Gilbert, who is an analyst and author of Toxic Capitalism. He joins us from Beijing. Also joining us today is Mr. Mustafa Talpur, who's leading the Oxfam Inequality campaign in Asia. He joins us from Islamabad. Thank you both for joining us, and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Mr. Talpur, let me jump to you. Now, we know that this pandemic has revealed already existing fault lines, already existing inequalities. But given all the research you do, was there anything new that was uncovered?
I think this pandemic, this discrepancy, as you know, is a long issue in the economic model. But the COVID has just exposed it. So it's not an accident. And it's the result of an economic model that delivers profit for the wealthy, while it extracts and milks from the poor and majority. So pandemic actually didn't create any economic, racial or gender inequalities. It has just exposed and amplified. So as you rightly mentioned, this new paper reveals that 32 of the world's most profitable companies are expected to make about 109 billion more in 2020 than what they made in the previous year. And you will be surprised to know that these 32 profitable corporations, as per our estimate, distributed over 1.3 trillion US dollars to their mostly wealthy stakeholders in last 4 years, that leading up to the pandemic. And these wealthy shareholders are mostly the men, and I can say the white men. So this was the level, and this money, even before that, the last decade for these 500 Fortune companies was really had a windfall gain. So they made from $820 billion profit in 2009 to $2.1 trillion in 2019. So a huge profit margin, and they had a lot of room to invest in people, in jobs, in climate-friendly technologies to shield these kind of pandemics and effects. But rather doing that and investing on workers and societies and climate, they actually doled out 90% of their profit to the wealthy shareholders. So this is actually a fallout of the shareholders' capitalism and crony capitalism that's sucking up the resources upward. And when the pandemic hit, people were not ready for it. And the governments who were denied by these corporations the tax revenue do not have enough and adequate resources to invest in the health resources and health staff and the people. So this is no it's a sad story, it's not a fortune. But if you just look how the Amazon has been making the profit, and we just calculated if during this pandemic, if Jeff Bezos could pay each of its 876,000 employees $105,000 bonus, still he will be as wealthy as he was before the pandemic. So this is how workers' rights have been denied pre-pandemic, and no result, better result is expected than post-pandemic if this system of the economic model that we continues.
Mr. Talpur, you mentioned Amazon, and you talked to us from Islamabad, and we have Mr. Gilbert Vankerckhove talking to us from Beijing. Is the case in terms of the wealthiest companies the same in Asia as well?
Yes. So the companies that we looked operating in US, in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea, Australia, Brazil, India, Nigeria, and South Africa. So you see these companies work across the globe and have gained power over states. In many poor states have a less power than the multinational global corporations. And so their ownership and their power and the political influence has grown, but it's also kept hidden. So you never know the company that's operating in Asia, whether it's owned by Asians or it is owned by Europeans or by North Americans. So because the interest of elite and rich, and then there are rich people shareholder of that company. So this model that is non-transparent, that shifting profits upward, shifting environmental and social costs downwards to the supply line, could be anywhere, because this is a fundamental problem with this economic model and the value chains model.
Right.
So
Mr. Talpur, stay with me on that. I want to jump to Mr. Vankerckhove and talk to him about this. How does that happen, Mr. Vankerckhove? In this time, that transparency, how does that happen? And take us through the political influence that these MNCs have on governments.
I think the survey shows a lot of new problems. As Mr. Mustafa was saying, it existed before, but now it has become worse. I would say there are two main reasons why this has been now becoming worse. But first of all, due to the pandemic, a lot of the small companies, even medium companies, have been very much weakened. So the big companies have taken over many of those small companies, or could I say, let them be dead and killed them. So the big companies have been growing. I would not say it's only just the multinationals, it's also the big companies. When we look at all the countries around the world, the problem is the same. Small and medium companies have suffered tremendously. While governments have been trying to help the economy by giving aid, we have also seen, especially also in the USA, that this aid has been going to the wrong people. It has been going to those big companies, multinationals or not. So they have become richer, but the money has not gone to the people who needed it most. One issue that was also mentioned is very important, is the gender issue. And the gender gap become worse because of the problems in the economy, people have been relying when, for example, we have a couple, well, the man tries to still secure a job while the wife does not have. So it has really brought a lot of problems. Now, how can we change that? Well, first of all, I think it's every country, it's a different situation. But this inequality, we see it also in China, we see it in Europe, we see it in the USA, we see it everywhere, but maybe with different colors and different circumstances. So there is not one solution for everybody. I think the most important is that the governments try to identify a way to help the small and medium companies so they don't go under and the big companies become bigger and bigger and bigger. But how to funnel this aid to the small, medium companies is not really that easy. I would not dare here to say how it should be done. It's a very complex issue. But this has to be dealt with, because otherwise, next year, we will see really a worsening of the situation. We see, you can look at coffee shops, but you can also look at whatever small businesses, people, small shops selling things, the big supermarkets, the Amazons, they have taken over that share of the market. So how can we solve this? We must find a way. But I would say every country has to look at the solution that fits its economy and its society.
Right, Mr. Vankerckhove, I take your point there, but something that you mentioned here that popped out to me, and I will take this to Mr. Mustafa Talpur, which is gender wage gaps, how those will worsen, and how those have already worsened during this pandemic, but what is expected to happen to our goals of trying to achieve gender parity, or at least move towards gender parity?
This is very interesting aspect. So ILO estimates that there are about 400 million jobs have been lost during this pandemic. And we estimate that women are disproportionately losing the job. But the other important element is that because majority of the women work in informal sector in Asia, so is in Pakistan, India, and many other Asian countries, 2/3 of employment in Asian economies is in informal sector, and none of the informal worker is protected under social protection programs. So the benefits that government regularly give to the workers, these women are not eligible to that, and majority of them is, of course, the workers that are working in agriculture sector and agriculture food value chains across Asia. We had many studies in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Myanmar, in Thailand, that seafood workers, workers in coffee value chains are being denied these social protection programs, and majority of these workers are women, and they are low paid because they are not unionized, and they are mainly contractual workers. So the bigger value chains actually contract out the local labor force. But let me come back on the point that Mr. Gilbert was making. So there are 5 ways where these big corporations are making their profit. So what they are doing, they are pushing the cost and risk down the supply chains. I'll give you an example. As I said, these companies, the 500 Fortune companies, who just distributed $9.1 trillion, are about 90% of their profit to shareholders. And when it came to the pandemic, they left workers, small producers, and suppliers. So just 10 of the largest apparel brands, the clothing companies alone, when they paid $21 billion, the profit to shareholders in 2019 as a dividends and buybacks. Now when you see in Bangladesh, in Mexico, and many other in Cambodia, when this pandemic hit, they cancel their orders, contracts, refuse to pay suppliers, and then those suppliers, and majority of these garment workers in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh are women. So they had no option but to leave the jobs. So this is how they work. And then they lobby governments for deregulation, more tax incentives and tax benefits, and doling out money to their shareholders and benefiting from government relief package. So they don't pay the taxes, they lay off the workers, and when governments announce the relief packages, again these big and large corporations come forward and benefit from those packages and take out that from the mouth of the poor people, and then jeopardizing workers' health. So the workers who are working for Amazon or major larger companies, they're actually compromising their health. Without having a benefit, they compromise their health. So this is how these companies are making their fortunes despite the pandemic, where people are queuing up and lining up to get a free coupon for the meal, while these companies are making fortunes out of this crisis. So this is everywhere, and this is going, if this is not changed, this is going to give a rise to inequality. So I mean, we propose few solutions. One, of course, is to have an excess profit tax, and any financial support to these businesses should be conditional. It shouldn't be like 2008 when big banks were bailed out on the cost of millions of poor workers. It has to be bound with that the companies will work for fair economy if they benefit from the government packages. And there should be an excess profit tax. And that can pay for the vaccine, a free vaccine for all the people on the planet if the billionaires just pay a pandemic tax.
Right.
So this is in the reform phase. Just let me conclude in a 30 second. And then there's need to be a reform in the corporate model that's just focusing on the profit. They need to redefine their purpose, why the businesses should exist if they don't want to serve the society, how they want to benefit the people, and ensuring that they transfer a fair share to the stakeholders and the small producers across the value chain, including workers, and radically transform the company governance and board, so people know how the profits are being distributed and shared.
Right.
And then, of course, in Asia and all around the world, I think people are talking about an alternate business model that are fair to all and they protect the environment.
Right. And I think that has been one of the central points for debate during this pandemic, which is how do we ensure that our our social security nets are widened in order to include more people. That will require for us to look towards an alternative business model, an alternative economic model. And we're going to have to keep understanding how we try to move towards that alternative. But that's all for today. And thank you so much for your time, Mr. Mustafa Talpur from Islamabad, Mr. Gilbert Vankerckhove from Beijing. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.